Welcome to 15-Minute Discourse. Today, we're taking a deep dive into human-robot interaction.
HRI for short.
Yeah, HRI. I think most people, when they think about robots, they think of sci-fi like iRobot or Star Wars. But how much of that is actually real?
Right.
And how much of it is just Hollywood making stuff up? So that's what we're going to be unpacking today.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What is human-robot interaction really about?
Well, at its core, HRI is about understanding and improving how humans and robots can work together, communicate, and basically just interact.
Okay, so it's not just about building robots that can do cool stuff. It's about building robots that can do cool stuff with people.
Yeah, exactly. It's about that interaction, making that interaction smooth, safe, and efficient, and even enjoyable.
Got it. So where do we see HRI in action today? Like, what are some real-world examples?
Oh, there's a bunch. I mean, HRI is popping up everywhere. Take healthcare. Surgical robots are already assisting surgeons with incredible precision.
Like Da Vinci.
Yeah, like the Da Vinci system, for instance. And it's not just surgery. Robots are helping with rehab
Yeah.
therapy, even providing companionship for the elderly.
So we're talking like robots that can help people recover from injuries or provide emotional support to folks who might be lonely.
Precisely. It's pretty incredible to think about.
It is. It's a far cry from, the robots we see in movies that are like bent on destroying humanity.
Yeah, Hollywood definitely loves to play up the robot apocalypse scenario.
Right. But it seems like in reality, robots are actually helping us in some pretty amazing ways.
Definitely. And, it's not just healthcare. Manufacturing has been a huge area for robotics, as you know, for decades.
Right, the classic assembly line robots.
Exactly. But what's interesting is the shift from robots simply replacing human workers to actually collaborating with them. We have these cobots.
The cobots.
Cobots, yeah. They are designed to work alongside humans, enhancing their capabilities rather than replacing them.
So it's like a human-robot team working together to get things done.
That's the idea. It's about leveraging the strengths of both humans and robots.
I like that. It's a much more collaborative vision of the future than what we often see in science fiction.
Absolutely. And it's happening right now.
So robots are moving from the factory floor to the operating room and maybe even the retirement home. But what about the everyday stuff? Like, are we going to have robots cooking our meals and folding laundry anytime soon?
Well, maybe not gourmet meals just yet, but we do have robotic vacuum cleaners like Roomba that are pretty commonplace in homes these days. And who knows what the future holds? Maybe someday we'll have robot chefs and personal stylists.
Robot chef. Sign me up for that.
That would be pretty amazing.
But I think it's important to point out that what we see in movies often doesn't match up with the reality of where robots are today.
Oh, definitely. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that robots have like this human level intelligence and emotions. We see robots in movies expressing feelings, forming relationships, making complex moral decisions.
Right, like they're our buddies or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not really accurate, is it?
Not quite. Remember that SoftBank Pepper robot?
Oh, yeah. Pepper. I remember seeing videos of it. It seemed pretty impressive.
Yeah. It was marketed as this emotionally responsive robot, but in reality, it was just using pre-programmed responses, no real understanding of emotions.
Oh, okay. So kind of like a chatbot with a fancy body.
Pretty much. And that kind of highlights the gap between like public perception and what robots can actually do.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy to get caught up in the hype and forget that robots are still machines, even if they look and act kind of human.
Right. And that gap can lead to like unrealistic expectations. People might think robots are ready to be our best friends or confidants when the technology just isn't there yet.
So we're not quite living in a world where robots can pass the Turing test and fool us into thinking they're human.
Not quite. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, so that brings us to the next big question. What's stopping us from having those super advanced human-like robots? Like, what are the challenges holding us back?
Well, there are a bunch of technical hurdles that researchers are still wrestling with. One of the biggest ones is this thing called multimodal perception.
Multimodal perception. Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean?
So basically, it means that robots need to be able to process information from multiple sources at once, just like humans do. We use our sight, sound, touch, all our senses to understand the world. And robots need to be able to do the same if they're going to interact with us naturally.
Okay, so if I'm talking to someone, I'm not just listening to their words. I'm also looking at their facial expressions, their body language, maybe even picking up on their tone of voice.
Exactly. We're constantly taking in information from all these different sources and integrating it into a coherent understanding of what's going on. And for robots, replicating that kind of multisensory understanding is really challenging.
So it's one thing for a robot to like recognize a face, but it's another thing entirely to understand the emotions and intentions behind that face.
Precisely. It's a whole other level of complexity.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, I can tell when my dog is happy or sad based on her tail wags and her barks, but that doesn't mean she's understanding my complex emotions.
Exactly. And it's the same with robots. We're a long way from robots truly understanding the nuances of human emotion and behavior.
So, how are researchers trying to tackle this challenge? Like, how do you teach a robot to understand the world the way we do?
It's a tough one. One approach is to use machine learning. You feed a robot tons of data, like images of faces labeled with emotions, and the robot learns to recognize those emotions based on subtle changes in facial features.
So, it's like showing a robot a million pictures of happy faces and saying, okay, this is what happy looks like.
Right, you got it. And the robot starts to pick up on those patterns, those subtle cues that tell us what someone is feeling.
It's pretty mind blowing to think about.
Mm.
But I imagine it's not as simple as just showing a robot a bunch of pictures.
Oh, definitely not. Another big piece of this puzzle is sensor fusion, where you combine data from different sensors like cameras, microphones, tactile sensors to create a more complete picture of the environment.
So it's not just about seeing or hearing in isolation, but about putting all those senses together like we do.
Exactly. And it's a huge challenge, but it's essential if robots are going to function effectively in human environments.
Okay, so we've got multimodal perception, robots learning to see and hear and feel the world like we do. What other hurdles are there?
Well, another big one is natural language interaction. We talked a bit about this earlier, how robots need to understand the nuances of human communication.
Right. It's like sarcasm, humor, all those things that make language so complex.
Exactly. And while we've made some pretty big strides in natural language processing, robots still struggle with those more subtle aspects of communication.
So it's one thing for a robot to understand the literal meaning of words, but it's another thing entirely to grasp the intent behind those words.
Exactly. Think about idioms, for instance. Like if I say, I'm feeling under the weather, a robot might literally think I'm standing underneath the weather.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
Right. So teaching robots to understand not just the words themselves, but also the context, the cultural references, all those layers of meaning that we take for granted, that's a huge challenge.
It's like trying to teach a robot to be a poet, right? To understand not just the dictionary definitions of words, but also the emotions and ideas they evoke.
Exactly. And that's not easy. But it's an area where researchers are making some interesting progress.
Okay, so we've got robots learning to see the world like us, learning to talk like us. But there's one big question that keeps popping up in my mind: autonomy. Just how independent are these robots? Are we talking about machines that can make their own decisions, or are they still largely under human control?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, because when I think of robots, I often think of those sci-fi scenarios where robots are running around, making their own choices, maybe even rebelling against humans.
Yeah, Hollywood loves that trope, but the reality is a bit more grounded.
So are we anywhere close to having robots that can truly think for themselves?
Well, think is a loaded word.
Okay, fair point. But robots making decisions, acting independently, that kind of thing.
We're seeing some advancements in robot autonomy, no doubt. I mean, self-driving cars are a good example.
Right. Those are pretty impressive.
But even self-driving cars are operating within a relatively controlled environment. Roads, traffic signals, all that.
Right. It's a predictable environment, in a way.
Exactly. But when you think about robots interacting with humans in all sorts of unpredictable situations, that's a whole different ballgame.
Because people do unexpected things.
Right.
We're not always rational or predictable.
Precisely. And for a robot to truly be autonomous, it needs to be able to adapt to all those unexpected things, make decisions on the fly, without needing constant human input.
So it's like the difference between a robot following a pre-programmed path and a robot figuring out its own path based on whatever it encounters.
You got it. And that level of adaptability, that's what's really challenging.
It makes sense. It's like we humans have millions of years of evolution behind us, developing our brains and our ability to navigate this complex world. robots are just starting out.
Exactly. And while we're making some pretty incredible progress, we need to be realistic about the challenges of creating truly autonomous robots. It's not going to happen overnight.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement and forget that we're still in the early stages of this journey. But it's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. HRI is full of challenges, but it's also full of possibilities. And who knows what amazing things we'll discover along the way.
Robot autonomy.
And like self-driving cars and stuff, and how that's really tough to get right in like unpredictable environments.
Especially when you've got humans in the mix. We are not always the most predictable creatures. But you know what's interesting to me is, like, we've been talking a lot about the technical side of things.
Yeah.
But what about the human side? Like, how do people actually react to robots?
Oh, that's a big one. I mean, that's a huge part of HRI is understanding how people perceive and respond to robots.
Right. Because it doesn't matter how advanced a robot is, if people are creeped out by it, they're not going to want to use it.
Totally. And, that's where this idea of the uncanny valley comes into play.
The uncanny valley. I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not sure I totally get it.
Okay, well, it basically describes this phenomenon where a robot looks almost human, but not quite. And it ends up kind of freaking people out.
Oh, so it's like those robots that look super realistic, but there's just something about them that's a little bit off.
Exactly. It's like our brains are wired to detect those subtle differences between humans and non-humans.
Right.
And when something's almost there, but not quite, it triggers this kind of primal unease.
So it's not just that the robot looks scary or anything.
Whoa, no.
It's like it's almost too human, and that's what's creepy.
Right. It's this weird feeling like something's not right. And it can be a real obstacle to people accepting robots.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, I've seen some of those hyper-realistic robot demonstrations, and they do make me feel a little bit uneasy.
Right. And it's not just you. A lot of people have that reaction. It's a real thing.
So how do robot designers deal with this uncanny valley problem? Like, do they just try to make robots look less human?
Well, there are different approaches. Sometimes, yeah, stylizing the robot's appearance can help.
So, like, making it clear that it's a robot and not trying to pass it off as a human?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of robots like Wall-E or R2-D2.
Oh, yeah, those are great examples. They're clearly robots.
Right.
But they're also super expressive and charming.
Exactly. So you don't always need human-like features to create engaging robots.
What are some other strategies?
Well, another approach is to focus on the robot's movements and behaviors.
Oh, so like how smoothly it moves, how natural its gestures are?
Yeah, exactly. Because even if a robot looks very human-like, if its movements are jerky or unnatural, it can still trigger that uncanny valley effect.
So it's not just about the static appearance, but also about how the robot interacts with the world.
Precisely. And this is where, animation research comes in handy. Because animators have spent decades studying human movement, right?
Yeah, to make cartoon characters move realistically.
Exactly. And we can apply those same principles to robot design, making their movements more fluid, more believable, less creepy.
That's really interesting. So we can actually learn from cartoons to make robots more human-like, but in a good way.
Exactly. And it's all about finding that right balance, creating robots that are engaging and relatable without falling into that uncanny valley trap.
So is it ever a good idea to make robots look superhuman-like?
It's a good question. And in some cases, it might be beneficial. Imagine a robot designed to provide companionship for elderly folks.
Okay.
Having a robot that looks and maybe even acts a little bit human could make people feel more comfortable and less lonely.
Right, because it would feel more natural to interact with something that resembles a human, especially for folks who might be feeling isolated.
Exactly. But even in those cases, we have to be careful not to make things too realistic and end up back in the uncanny valley.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between human-like and robot-like.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance.
You know, we've been talking a lot about how people perceive robots, but I'm wondering if the reverse is also true. Like, do robots perceive us? I mean, do they see us as individuals, or are we just like a bunch of data points to them?
Oh, that's a really deep question. And it gets at the heart of what perception really means.
Right, because when we humans perceive things, we're not just taking in sensory information.
Yeah.
We're interpreting it. We're assigning meaning to it based on our experiences, our emotions, our whole understanding of the world.
And that's where things get tricky with robots. They don't have those same experiences or emotions that shape our perception.
So even if a robot can, like, see us and hear us, it doesn't mean it's seeing us the same way another human would.
Right. Their perception is based on algorithms and data. They can recognize patterns, make predictions, even learn in a way,
Uh-huh.
but it's not the same as human understanding.
So it's like the difference between looking at a photo of a sunset and actually being there, feeling the warmth on your skin, smelling the salty air, hearing the waves crashing.
That's a great analogy. The photo captures some of the information, but it's not the same as the lived experience.
Exactly. And I guess that raises some really big questions about consciousness and what it actually means to perceive and understand the world. But I think those are questions for another podcast.
Definitely. But it's a good reminder that as robots become more advanced, we need to keep those differences in mind.
So it's not just about teaching robots to be more human-like, it's also about understanding the limits of that mimicry.
Absolutely. And appreciating what makes us human in the first place.
Well said. This deep dive into the world of robots has been fascinating. We've talked about everything from the technical challenges of robot perception to the philosophical questions of consciousness, but we haven't even touched on the impact of robots on society.
Right. Like how robots might change the way we work, interact with each other. That's a whole other can of worms.
And I know we're going to get into all that soon. But now I think it's time to talk about the big question that's on everyone's mind. How are robots going to change society?
Right. I mean, as robots become more and more a part of our lives, they're going to have a huge impact on how we work, how we live, how we interact with each other.
So let's address the elephant in the room. Job displacement. Are robots going to steal all our jobs?
It's a concern a lot of people have, and it's important to talk about it. Automation definitely changes the nature of work. Some jobs will be lost, yeah.
But doesn't that happen every time there's like a big technological shift?
Yeah, it's true. Think about the Industrial Revolution. Lots of agricultural jobs disappeared, but new jobs were created in manufacturing and other industries.
So it's not just about jobs vanishing, it's about jobs changing, right?
Exactly. And I think the same thing's going to happen with robots. As robots take over certain tasks, new jobs will pop up in areas like robot design, maintenance, even training robots.
So maybe instead of being scared of robots taking our jobs, we should be thinking about how we can adapt and learn the skills we need to work alongside them.
I think that's a great way to look at it. It's not just about technical skills either. It's also about things like critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, the kinds of things that are uniquely human.
So robots could actually free us up to focus on more interesting and fulfilling work, the stuff that robots can't do.
Exactly. But we do need to be proactive. We need to make sure people have the training and support they need to make this transition.
So we need to invest in education, in new programs that teach people the skills for this robot-powered future.
Absolutely. And we also need to think about the ethical side of all this. How do we make sure the benefits of robotics are shared fairly? How do we prevent bias in algorithms used in robots? These are really important questions.
That's a crucial point. It's not just about the tech itself. It's about how we use it, how we make sure it serves humanity.
Exactly. We have a choice in how we integrate robots into society. It's not something that's just happening to us. We get to shape this future.
So how do we make sure robots are used for good? How do we ensure that they make our lives better, not worse?
Well, I think open and honest conversations are a good place to start. We need to bring everyone to the table, not just scientists and engineers, but ethicists, policymakers, everyday people, everyone who's going to be impacted by this technology.
So we need to democratize the conversation about robots, make sure everyone has a voice.
I think so. And we need to be proactive. We need to anticipate the challenges and be prepared to address them.
It's about taking responsibility for the future we're creating.
And making sure it's a future where robots help us thrive as humans, not replace us.
I like that. Robots helping us thrive. That's a great way to think about it. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. We've explored so much about human-robot interaction, from the technical nuts and bolts to the big picture questions about society and the future.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity and maybe even inspired you to think a little differently about the robots that are increasingly becoming part of our world.
And remember, the future of HRI is being shaped right now, so stay informed, ask questions, and be a part of the conversation.
And that's it for this episode of 15-Minute Discourse. If you enjoyed our exploration of human-robot interaction, please like and subscribe and tell your friends about the show. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.
Thanks for listening.